Tony Kinnett.
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 Host of the Tony Kinnett Cast.
Let's get down to business.
You're listening to the Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WYBC.
Here on the Daily Signal.
Good evening and welcome to the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated. A lot of news to get to. At the very, very foundation of it all, though, is one common point. The Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, Tim Walz, left-wing infrastructure, both in the media and on the campaign trail, are scraping the bottom of the barrel. Now all of the chips are in. This is it, with just 47 days to go until November 5th. All of the cards are now on the table. And we know this for a couple of reasons, but before we get into those reasons, let's talk about why it's time to actually throw all of the chips into the pot and say, as they do, I'm all in. Well, the election is basically at a deadlock. So pollsters all the way from Nate Silver over to those at 538, Nate Silver's former publication, to Rasmussen over on the right, pollsters are finding Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. And then Donald Trump and J.D. Vance deadlocked in the swing states. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, a little bit of Georgia and North Carolina, depending on the poll. Arizona and Nevada are in toss-up territory. According to polls, and this is where things get a little bit hairy for the Harris-Walz campaign, this poll data is before the Trump assassination attempt, the second one, which took place just this last week. Iran sharing hacked Trump campaign files with members of the Biden-Harris campaign officials and surrogates. And then, of course, the Teamsters drama, in which one of the largest unions in the country, the Teamsters, pulled their own members. And after finding out that the majority, almost a supermajority of their members, preferred Trump over Harris, chose not to endorse anyone at all. Those are serious blows to the Harris campaign. And a lot of these polls are starting to factor in her debate performance. It's just not enough. So it's time to press the emergency big red button that any campaign pushes in an incumbency run into an election cycle. It's time to cut the federal rates, ladies and gentlemen. And so, Chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, came out yesterday to announce that interest rates were getting cut. And we already knew this. Really, everybody was already very well aware of kind of where this was going. This is something we were, not really a shocker. As far as the Biden administration coming out 47 days before the election and announcing they're going to cut rates by 0.5%, or about 50 basis points, in order to kick the stock market into overdrive is just not shocking. So what are the actual effects going to look like from this particular rate drop? Well, here are the results so far. In the last 2 days, the stock market has been superheated. This is pretty much the only good thing that's coming out of this 0.5 percentage point rate cut at the moment. The Dow, S&P 500 closed at record highs, and the NASDAQ is surging amid what many are calling kind of a rate cut euphoria. Now, this is where things get a little bit hairy. And it has to do with a trinity of really bad situations. First of all, our inflation concerns. Cutting the interest rate before inflation has really been dealt with puts people on very, very sketchy, very tepid, very weird water. It's not even skating on thin ice. It's basically praying that you're going to be walking on water in regard to the inflation not really being down below 2%, which is what Powell was shooting for this entire time. Then we get to the borrowing issues. So here's where things start to get very worrisome for the long-term U.S. economy. So the Fed cuts rates, but borrowing rates went higher today because they're based on the 10-year yield, and it is ripping even higher into the close. So what does this mean? This means that mortgage and auto loan rates are likely to be higher tomorrow than they were today. Which is funny because the entire point of the rate cut is that mortgages are supposed to get a lot cheaper. Well, if people are looking at 10, 15, and 30-year rate trends, you're not actually going to see a lot of borrowing take place, which is going to superheat the economy very quickly. And by the way, here's a friendly reminder. 10 out of the last 14 Fed rate cut cycles directly led to a recession. The only times that they didn't, this is according to Nick Jourly, 1966, 84, 95, and in 98, when the economy was, a lot stronger than it is today. Going back all the way to 1957, anytime there's been a considerable Fed rate cut, it's led to a recession. And that brings us to the last horse in this apocalyptic scenario, which I've seen nobody talking about beyond the initial statement that was made by Jerome Powell, because this is beyond egregious. So, employment. According to the July jobs report, unemployment shot up to 4.3%, which is the highest it's been since October 2021, when everyone was still reeling from a lot of COVID restrictions. Since then, the unemployment rate has dropped to about 4.2%, but foreign workers in the United States, foreign-born workers, gained 635,000 jobs, whereas native-born workers in the United States over the last couple of years have lost 1.3 million jobs. It is a net loss for people born in the United States as far as employment is concerned. Jerome Powell finally addressed this today, and in an absolute shocking moment, he blamed it on illegal immigrants. Check it out.
So on the job creation, it depends on the inflows, right? So if you're having millions of people come into the labor force, and you're creating 100,000 jobs, you're going to see unemployment go up. So it really depends on what's the trend underlying the volatility of people coming into the country. We understand there's been quite an influx across the borders, and that has actually been one of the things that's allowed unemployment rate to rise. And the other thing is just a slower hiring rate.
So I don't know if you caught that. That's Jerome Powell openly admitting that the main cause of unemployment increase in the United States was that since Joe Biden took office in 2021, opening illegal immigration floodgates open has given a lot of jobs to illegal immigrants. That's what actually has caused a huge portion of the unemployment rate going up. Now, that is groundbreaking to be said by the chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve. And people kind of stop there. This is where the coverage that I've seen over the last couple of days ends. This is so wildly insane as far as a memory holding by the mainstream media. I really haven't ever seen anything like this since the left turning around and pretending that they didn't actually lock down the country and advocate for lockdowns for like eternity during COVID-19. Allow me to explain. So, on February the 6th, Jerome Powell was on 60 Minutes actually trying to tell everybody that actually allowing tons of illegal immigrants in saved the U.S. economy, stabilized employment, and basically just saved us from complete economic collapse. Complete tone shift. This is Jerome, back in February.
What are the important factors that cause the labor market to stabilize?
One was just a return of workers. Several million people were just gone from the labor force for whatever reason. Many of them didn't want to go back to their old jobs because of COVID or because they just didn't want to be. They had moved on with their lives. So there was a desperate shortage of workers. And what happened is we expected people to come right back into the workforce in 2022. They mostly didn't. And then we thought, well, maybe that's not going to happen. And then it happened in 2023. We had a combination of rising labor force participation in prime age workers. And we also had, with that, we had a resumption of immigration. So there was really no immigration net or very little during the pandemic. But in 2023, we saw immigration move back up to the levels that would have been normal before the pandemic.
Did you catch that? Again, the point that Jerome Powell was making in February was that a lot of people lost their jobs during COVID. And then he just pretends that those jobs just evaporated. Like those jobs just didn't exist anymore until the illegal immigrants came in, because during the COVID pandemic, Trump had the Remain in Mexico policy pretty firmly in place. Then the illegal immigrants came in, largely through the southern border and a lot through Biden's migration programs, and took a lot of those jobs. At the time, he was saying, oh, that stabilized the economy. Oh, it's fantastic. By the way, then the Biden administration was caught lying and inflating jobs numbers, resulting in the biggest jobs correction in U.S. history.
You know, the range of how many jobs they would take away for a variety of reasons, maybe the largest is the birth-death model for businesses, was going to be somewhere between 350,000 and 1 million. It comes in at 818,000.
So 818,000 jobs were overestimated by the Biden administration with regard to, again, the actions from the federal labor agencies as well as the Federal Reserve. Took a look at how all of these things are factoring, recognized that illegal immigration was causing a severe damage to the employment rates in this country, and then praised it anyway. And by the way, praised it loudly. Basically went from saying in 2020 and in 2021 that we had a huge labor shortage and only opening the border could save us. This was from CNN. America needs immigrants to solve its labor shortage. That's by Vanessa Yurkovich. And then 2 months ago, organizations like the Wall Street Journal's article, Barron's, was reporting that the immigration situation in the United States was actually just neutral for inflation. So Jerome Powell has gone in 4 years, just 4 years from saying the labor shortage needs illegal immigration to save it. Then illegal immigration is actually saving the labor market and stabilizing things. Then 2 months ago, Jerome Powell says immigration is neutral for inflation and the labor shortage. And now he's completely flipped all the way around and is now telling the country, actually, illegal immigration is the cause of the high unemployment rate that is continuing to rise. Now, here's the kicker, and this really should be concerning. The last 2 times the Fed's first cut was over 50, was basically over 0.5%, was in January 3rd, 2001. Unemployment rose another 2.1%. They did it again in September 18th, 2007. Unemployment rose 5.3%. So take a wild guess as to how that's going to affect the economy in the next couple of years. It's amazing. The Biden administration, through Alejandro Mayorkas and Jerome Powell, literally in 4 years went from we desperately need illegal immigration to save the economy to illegal immigration is destroying the employment market, and we have no idea who did this. Oh, gee, what a shocker. Up next, we're going to be talking just a little bit to Bill Wirtz over from Consumer Choice, talking a little bit about some regulatory stuff, and then Rebecca Downs from townhall.com. Stick around. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated and first on 93 WIBC.
It's the Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WIPC.
Welcome back to the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, now nationally syndicated. There are a lot of fine folks over at Consumer Choice. One of the best is Bill Wirtz. Now, Bill Wirtz can mean a lot of things out there in the wide world. It can mean a very wacky music and video producer, or one of the finer industrial and economic policy minds of our time. And we brought that one on because Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has joined the Trump campaign, and they're doing a lot of work together, and there's a lot of enthusiasm. Oh man, he's going to come in with a big sledgehammer and do all of this amazing regulatory reform. Well, Stephen Kent, who is normally on with us for What You Watchin' when he's not absolutely crushing it in a council election in Virginia, co-wrote an article with Bill Wirtz here for the American Spectator, was it?
That's correct.
Absolutely. On why maybe before you get out your popcorn, your sparklers, and your fireworks for the excitement of RFK like a bull in the china shop of regulatory reform, well, might want to put a little bit of a pin in that one. Bill, thanks for hopping on with us.
Thank you for having me, Tony. I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's quite an interesting one, because when RFK talked about who he was considering endorsing, he actually said that he was considering both campaigns. So he really looked at what is the biggest benefit here for me. And RFK, he has one thing that he has always regretted in his career that he never got, and that was being head of the EPA. And I think now he thinks that this is his best shot at getting there. Now, a lot of people cheer for RFK because he doesn't have many good things to say about the Biden administration and about Kamala Harris, and I can understand where they're coming from. But the enemy of your enemy is not necessarily your friend.
I was going to jump in with that as soon as you took a breath and you beat me to it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's one of those classics, right? And the thing is that if you actually compare RFK and Trump on policy, because I mean, with Donald Trump, we do have an experience with actual 4 years as president. And when he appointed Scott Pruitt as head of the EPA, Scott Pruitt actually got a lot of deregulation to fix a lot of the damage that had been done under the Obama years. So, for instance, reauthorizing essentially the use of the herbicide atrazine, the thing that RFK thinks makes the frogs gay. So it's a lot of these conspiracy theories that RFK brings to the table that would be incredibly damaging to American agriculture. I think conservatives that care about agriculture, maybe if you politically align on some of the things that RFK says and the way he comes across, I can understand that. But I think on policy, letting people like this anywhere near the halls of power would be very damaging. And
that's a concern that has popped into my mind with regard of the rise of the populism movement, because there's a lot of good things that have come out of the populism movement. No, I'm sorry, the college that you went to does not automatically entitle you to getting a free pass on never being criticized again. That kind of anti-establishmentarianism, just being elite for the sake of elitism, is not a good thing. That's been a good part of the populism movement. Also, a lot of institutions that have started using their power for ill and not for good, some of them kind of a century into it, not exactly starting. Sorry, when I think of the Federal Reserve, for instance. But just because there are some good things that have come out of the populism movement doesn't mean that all of a sudden anything a populist gets up there and rants is good policy. And RFK Jr. is a perfect example of this. And I whenever he gets out there and starts talking about things need to change, he's very willing to pick up the governmental mallet to do so. And we've become so used to political campaigns wielding the political mallet of promise that we've kind of come to expect that it's not whether or not we need governmental reform or regulation, it's just which party's going to wield it. And I mean, I don't mean to get dramatic here. Obviously, that's dangerous, but quite honestly, it's just downright stupid. And that's frustrating because there's a lot of work to be done.
There really is. And RFK is such a walking contradiction on a lot of these things. I mean, he says that you should be a skeptic on so many of those big topics, that coming from the man who a couple of years ago suggested everyone skeptical on climate change should be imprisoned. He says that there's always a monetary there's always a monetary influence in those agencies, but actually fails to reveal in many of those podcast appearances that he used to sue all of these companies for money. He was a trial lawyer, so he would take big companies to court, pretend their products would create a health problem, and then, because these were class action lawsuits, all of those funds that the big companies then would eventually pay out in their settlements, most of that would go to the law firms, meaning into his own pocket. So he did this for money for such a long time. And the whole premise of many of the theories that he puts out there is because he wanted to impress these juries. So somebody potentially going to a jury, like one of those trials in the future, would be impressed by what he says on the Joe Rogan podcast, and therefore would sway the court in one direction or the other. So he's been doing this as a career lawyer, and now he wants to make it into politics and policy. And I just don't see how it fits with a Trump administration that actually has a pretty positive track record on a lot of these things. When it comes to regulatory approvals, actually very reasonable. A lot of these, very drastic changes that you would have expected from these Trump appointees actually were pretty smart regulation. Things that actually worked out when it comes to tax reforms, when it comes to environmental policy. A lot of that was good in those 4 years, and it's not perfect. But somebody like RFK, he says that he wants to appoint activists to these agencies. And honestly, appointing RFK to the EPA in order to make it more independent, that would be like appointing Joe Biden as the speechwriter of Kamala Harris in order to give her speeches more clarity.
And that's exactly what I wanted to hit on. That's some of the stuff that I was looking up actually while you were kind of going into a little more detail on that last point. I really have an issue with individuals that believe that all we need in these governmental regulatory agencies are different employees. And in fact, you get into this very weird situation in which the private conversations you have with someone that you're friendly with end up getting into staffer positions that really they have no business being in that, staffing organization or that agency whatsoever. But this, to kind of bring it around full circle, this doesn't mean that I'm against, RFK Jr. endorsing Trump or endorsing whoever it is that he wants to. And by the way, it also doesn't mean that I disagree with some of his opinions on kind of like a chronic health crisis and some things about how the United States has kind of lowered its standards on a lot of things. But it's this idea that we have is because one person says things I like, that therefore they must be as good on the answers as my heroes or the political greats or whoever it is that you want making the policy. We give authority out so willingly because they agree with us. Kennedy's a really good example of why that's a bad idea. I'm glad Kennedy's out there campaigning for Trump. I'm glad Tulsi Gabbard's out there campaigning for Trump. But as a conservative, God forbid they actually get institutional power, because guess what? They're not. They're not conservatives. They're not libertarians. they're not. They may have been kicked out of the Democratic Party, but that doesn't automatically make them policy experts.
It does not. And what somebody like RFK tried to do is tear the trust in many of the institutions and resources that we use to get evidence-based policymaking, to get scientific knowledge, tries and tear it all down. And when you tear it all down and nobody trusts anyone and anything anymore, then that's not an ideology. Then you're just a full-time skeptic. And you're just like a French revolutionary toddler just trying to tear everything apart. Exactly, and that's not leading us anywhere. That is not conducive of a working economy. This is not how we can do industrial policy. If the U.S. wants to get back on track as to where it was in terms of trajectory, it needs trust in institutions and scientific institutions to do their job properly.
It really is an interesting concept to look at, for example, the difference between J.D. Vance and RFK Jr. RFK Jr. wanting to go in there and just kind of wreck through all of these agencies. Then there's also the free market wing of the Republican Party that doesn't really want agencies, especially trade commissions and things, with almost any regulatory power at all. And then you have J.D. Vance, who wants a very heavy-handed approach to the American industrial sector and policy. It's like three polar opposites of this bizarre political triangle that are all coming into this next administration. I don't think people realize how much discordance again, vastly preferable to Kamala Harris, there is going to be, as some of these policies are forced to reckon with one another.
Yes, and it is incumbent upon Donald Trump to give more clarity on these things. I mean, ultimately, all of these groups are trying to get his attention and trying to get his decision making, and he cannot allow himself the inconsistencies in what he presents to the American public, of trying to mingle all of those three together to get the extra votes. I think voters appreciate consistency, and this is the plan, not this is the next podcast where I can get more of an audience. It's like, this is the actual plan I'm trying to lay out here. This is a consistent model of my policy, and ultimately that is what he tried to do in his first term.
Right.
Let's see if he can get a second one based on the trust that he can actually deliver on policy. But if he gets pulled in every possible direction because he will just agree with the previous speaker at a rally, I think that's not conducive of a good candidate.
I agree. Unfortunately, we're running a little bit short on time. Bill Wirtz over from Consumer Choice. It's good to have you, as always. Take care, my man.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be back in just a second. Don't go anywhere. This is the Tony Kinnett Cast on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated and first on 93 WIBC.
Phones aren't working.
It's the Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WIPC.
Hey, welcome back to the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated. We're bringing on one of our favorites, Rebecca Downs from townhall.com, to bring us the down low on all kinds of nonsense all around the country. And today, a special international down low because the UN is up to stuff again. So, Rebecca, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. So this does have to do with Israel, which we talk about often. It's not just the Squad that we're having to deal with their anti-Israel bias. It is the United Nations. On Wednesday, they held a vote, and it was not only anti-Israel in being against Israel's right to defend itself, it's trying to put Israel back to the pre-1967 line. So they want the IDF out of there. And the vote, it wasn't even close. It was 124 to 14. And there were 43 abstentions. Now, the United States, they did object to this vote, which we expect from them. Hopefully that's not expecting too much from the United Nations, from the United States to stand by our ally. But the problem with this is that it doesn't even mention October 7th, right? So It doesn't acknowledge that Israel has been going through a lot right now, especially. And when it comes to the United Nations is already an anti-Israel body, right? So I wasn't expecting much from this, but it was worse than what I was expecting. Gotcha. And I was actually talking to Andrew Tucker. He is with Think. So they do a lot of work analyzing The Hague and other anti-Israel bias in these international bodies.
Yeah, kind of an international watchdog organization.
Exactly. I think that's a great way to describe it. And he called the resolution appalling, right? But it's been going on this has kind of been in the works for a while. So he filled me in with some really interesting history that the Palestinian state is kind of trying to become a member. They've been trying to do this, get involved since 2011, 2012. So this is years in the making. They've been trying to go to the United Nations to put about their anti-Israel bias.
So what you're saying is that like the Palestinian Authority, or Hamas, who's obviously been the main political wing in charge of the Gaza Strip, representing the Palestinian state, even though, again, not a state.
Palestinian.
The Palestinian core in this particular situation, basically their entire ethos is to go to the UN and try to get these resolutions passed that condemn Israel for, whatever, day ending in Y. Here's the main question that I've got out of this. What happens after one of these resolutions pass? I mean, is this just for show? Is it just musical chairs theater? I mean, what is it actually that comes out of a resolution like this?
So that is a great question, because I did notice there's a lot of great reporting from the Jerusalem Post, and in talking to Andrew Tucker, he said it's a political conversation, he called it, right? So it's not a binding resolution, but it does give fodder to anti-Israel forces. I noticed yesterday, this is when the vote took place, CARE applauded the decision or the resolution. They called on the Biden administration to abide by it. And I'll remind you, CARE, their leaders have praised October 7th, the butchery and just the slaughter that took place that day. So it's not surprising that groups like CARE would applaud this resolution, but I find that no less appalling. And the Squad members, I noticed, they did not talk about it on social media. From what I saw, that is because they were so busy lamenting all the memes and the celebrations about the Hezbollah terrorists being blown up by pagers, by walkie-talkies. So that's not to say that they're on the fence about this. They also were reposting Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, unfortunately, is a anti-Israel, especially anti-Netanyahu member in the Senate right now. He is trying to pause weapons. Still, he has a new plan for that came about earlier this week. So it's not that the Squad members, the usual suspects, are being quiet about it because they're on the fence. They don't know. They don't care. They're busy with other anti-Israel business of theirs.
So I want to bring this home because the issue that we get in a lot of interviews like this is people listen and go, okay, great. What does this have to do with me? Why do I care? Obviously, the conversation for a long time is, well, Israel is a core ally of the United States in the region. That's not enough for a lot of people when we're considering how the United States is A, spending its money, and B, how foreign policy is developed. And I think this is where we need to bring it to a capstone of our interests in the region, everything from international trade all the way to how individuals in the region are treated who are American citizens, are that radical Islamist terror groups funded by Iran, whether Hezbollah, whether the Houthis in Yemen that now have control of the Red Sea, whether it's Hamas in the Gaza Strip, what have you, are not given a foothold in the United Nations to bring greater bear against United States policy interests.
Exactly.
Because
we don't want,
we still have to sell our goods on the world market. We still have to maintain trade routes. We still have to, again, every citizen of the United States should be free to go wherever they darn well please in the world. And I'm sorry, but Hezbollah controlling southern Lebanon is not in any way, shape, or form effective towards those aims or goals.
Yeah, we don't want to give them any legitimacy. And I think how that speaks to, okay, how does that matter to me? Well, besides the fact that Israel is our ally and it's the only democracy in that region, it's a stable country in that region, I think it speaks to a further push to defund the United Nations. So that's a push we've seen from Chip Roy and Mike Lee. They've been a little busy this week talking about the SAVE Act, but I actually did do an exclusive last December about how they are really trying to defund the United Nations, get the United States out of there.
Really good point. I mean, you actually, I think that to be a part of an organization, you need a litany of positives, not just the absence of negatives, because it costs us money to be a part of any group. You need
and space in New York City.
Well, of course. I mean, there's obviously the property, but it costs the United States a good chunk of change in our budget to fund the United Nations and to bankroll a lot of their initiatives in human rights initiatives, etc. We need good things coming out of the UN to make that payment worthwhile, right? I'm paying for something. Right now, we're building a studio for the show. When I pay the contractors, I need them to actually produce something that is worth the money, the time, the effort, and, with our troops, the blood and sweat and tears of their families when, God forbid, horrible things happen. And so,
yeah, you better get something out of that, Tony. Yeah.
Bingo. So when we're taking a look at the United Nations, I think that one of the most effective arguments against the United States kind of bowing down to these radical Muslim groups and phony UN resolutions is that we're paying a huge chunk of money into the UN, and I'm sorry, but the UN is garbage, and if the UN and its member nations are willing to sympathize and simp for this kind of stuff, shut the UN down, get it out of New York, as you said, close the building down, turn it into a U-Haul warehouse, I don't care. I'm not funding radical Islamist terrorism that has slaughtered more Jews, Christians, agnostics, Sikhs, Bedouins, Sunnis than any other force on planet Earth. Just ain't happening.
And it's not just sympathy. If I could emphasize legitimacy to the Palestinian state, to terrorist sympathizers.
I mean, it really does give, we talked about this during the Cold War and kind of the Soviet Union creating these fake states that would be propped up and given UN votes themselves. Whereas here with the United States now, what we are seeing from our foreign policy perspective is Iran desperately trying to create the same type of puppet states to gain more legitimacy towards giving Iran and its client states across this kind of neo-caliphate of Shia nations the authority to appoint whatever kinds of resources and rights it wants with the authority of the United Nations, from the Human Rights Council to getting on the Security Council. Right? It's a mess. Absolutely.
So-called Human Rights Council.
Well, I think we have to kind of cut things a little bit short there for today. Rebecca, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
From townhall.com, the editor that makes the site better. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back in just a second. Don't go anywhere. This is the Tony Kinnett Cast on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated and first on 93 WIBC.
Uh-oh.
You're listening to the Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WIBC.
Hey, welcome back to the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated, first on 93 WIBC out of Indianapolis, with the Fed finally swinging in and delivering the lower interest rate, the cut that we are so used to in an election season. Why do I suggest that this truly is scraping the bottom of the barrel? Isn't there anything left, anything at all, that the incumbent group can do? And then, of course, what is the Trump campaign doing? And these are very important questions. You have to dig into them, because if there really aren't any more cards to throw out on the table, we actually could see the polls start to stabilize, and then things get really interesting. Here's the deal. So, when you're going to talk about federal interest rate cuts and not also release the petroleum reserve, that's the bottom of the barrel. They can't really release any more of the strategic petroleum reserve for the United States because Biden's already had the tap on full blast throughout his entire term. There's very little left that can be spent on the civilian economy. What else is there really for the Biden administration to do? Congress is in a deadlock. So is there really anything else that they can do from the incumbent side? No, they kind of have to ride out the economy. And this is why Biden came out today and said very openly that this isn't a mark of victory, it's a mark of progress. Because he can't actually claim victory over this particular economy. He has to tell everyone, well, I know that I said we were all going to be fine, but actually what you really need to do is wait for the goodness of the next term under Kamala Harris. Now, we've been seeing this under 4-year plans since they've been around. And of course, I've seen this in a lot of DEI schools that claim that, oh yeah, our racial policies may not have worked before, but this time, yeah, that kind of thing isn't really going to appeal to voters. It's really the last things that they have, which is why they've been selling the mediocre list of not prominent Republicans like Liz Cheney and some former lieutenant governor from New Jersey you've never heard about is endorsing Kamala Harris, who no Republicans like or know. So what about the Trump campaign? Well, the Trump campaign's also kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel at this point. And the reason that you know this is because everything that we know about Trump is already baked into the cake. That's it. Everyone's already made up their mind on Donald Trump. You know how he governs. You know how he campaigns. You know how he talks. You know how he leads. You know what his good parts are. You know what his flaws are. So what else do they have? Well, all they've really got left for the Trump campaign are campaign promises compared to the administration of the last 4 years. And this is why Trump is coming out and basically announcing all of these micro kind of specific tax cuts in certain areas of the economy, things that maybe he'll be able to accomplish, things that he probably won't be able to accomplish. At this point, really, that's all he's got. He kind of has a few last-minute Hail Mary passes. Now, Kamala's been making Hail Mary passes her entire campaign. Trump really hasn't made a lot of Hail Mary passes since he announced his candidacy. When Trump announced his candidacy for re-election in this particular cycle, way early, he was talking about sending somebody to Mars and doing all of this crazy stuff that the United States really hadn't looked forward in that kind of a fashion, really since the middle of the Cold War. So as far as that making an impact on the election, I got to tell you, we really don't know. But my particular, call it maybe a prediction at this point, if I can wager something like that, I would suggest that if all Trump and Kamala have is just a scraping of the bottom of the barrel from now until the end of the election, because absentee ballots are already going out. That's also why they're flailing. They're like, oh man, the absentee and the mail-in ballots are starting to go out in a lot of states, especially the swing states. Do everything you can. Now we're going to be in a weird holding pattern for the election. We're going to see what the polls truly start to boil out to. Thank you very much for tuning in this evening. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Jerry Lopez will be guest hosting the show tomorrow. We'll see you next week. This is the Tony Kinnett Cast here on 93 WIBC, the Daily Signal, and our syndicated partners. Take care.